Good morning and good afternoon and good evening or good very late night if you are in India or South Asia. Our event today is very exciting because it cuts across several themes that are all, I think, increasingly in the news and in policymakers' minds. Most directly, it's of course about technology and technology policy, but it's also about India's strategic competition with China and its strategic partnership with the US. We are asking the question today, can India be a tech superpower? For decades, people have touted India's potential in information technology. And traditionally, this has mostly been in the world of software development. And India certainly has a large and highly skilled IT workforce and a significant presence here in Silicon Valley. But is that the same thing as being able to capture the commanding heights of high-tech competition globally and leverage that technology for national power in the context of strategic competition? To discuss what I think is this fascinating question are three experts who will attack this problem from different angles on the technology itself, on tech policy, and on India's approach. First, we have Dr. Edlyn Levine, who is the chief technologist at the MITRE Accelerator, where she's responsible for accelerating technologies in partnership with the private sector. And she's also a research associate at Harvard. We have Professor Arogyaswami Paulraj, or Paul, as we'll call him, an emeritus professor of electrical engineering here at Stanford, who has himself invented some wireless tech and been an advisor to the highest levels of the Indian government. And we have Trisha Ray from the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi, staying up very late for us, where her research focuses on the geopolitics and security implications of emerging technologies like AI and 5G. You can read more about our amazing experts and their research on our website for the event. But as always, we have a ton to get through, so I'll just make one more housekeeping announcement. If you out there in Zoom land have questions, please don't hesitate to share them, but use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Time is very short, so I will be ruthless in bundling them, and so please keep them short and to the point. So with that, let's begin. I want to start by just scoping the nature of the problem and its importance in international politics. So let's begin by understanding what it is that we're talking about. What are the relatively new or emerging technologies, especially in information and communications technology, which are the most important for national power today? I might ask first Edlyn and then Paul, what do you think the landscape is when we're talking about these technologies? What technologies are we actually talking about? And to sort of explain where I'm coming at this from, I would suggest that the most important technologies are those that either have the biggest military and commercial applications that change the nature of a country's national power, or that may be the hardest technologies to master. Or maybe I'm missing something. So Edlyn, what do you see as being the technologies that we're talking about?
So Arzan, thank you for the question and fantastic to be here. When it comes to, strategic technology development, what you tapped on before, the ICT, the information communication technologies, is the engine that drives modern digital economies. So being in a leadership position in those technologies, both from a R&D and pioneering point of view, as well as from a production point of view, is essential. And that's true both for commercial as well as for military applications. If we look at the state of ICT technologies, the typical technology vantage point or perspective is that there is an entire what is called compute stack that supports these technologies. That's from the top of the compute stack, which many of us are familiar with, new applications, new drivers and software that can actually leverage the existing, foundations of circuits and architectures and devices and materials that are used to actually build computing devices. What is changing now? So over the era of Moore's law, over the past several decades, Moore's law talks about the doubling time of the number of transistors you can fit on a single integrated circuit is actually driven by the capability to scale, dimensionally scale these transistors to smaller and smaller device points. What's changing now is that we are essentially running out of runway on that dimensional scaling paradigm, two-dimensional scaling, because the size of those devices, of transistor devices, is actually nearing to the atomic scale. And when you end up going into the atomic scale, you have a different physics, right? Quantum physics that bears hold. And it's quantum physics on the individual atomic level, not on the many-body quantum physics that really governs transistor behavior. And so we are very, very frankly running out of space. And so that is what's changing when we look at the future of technology development over the next several decades that's different from the previous decades. The previous decades, driven by two-dimensional scaling, a lot of the innovation happened on the top of the stack. And that's where exactly in your introduction, you mentioned India has tremendous strengths at the top of the compute stack. What's going to change and what's going to be needed for leadership in the future is innovation at the bottom of the stack. That's changing the way that we do compute from a conceptual and architectural level, maybe moving into quantum computing, neuromorphic computing, in-memory compute are going to be big technology drivers, as well as different materials that could be leveraged and different, configurations. For example, a lot of innovation is going to happen in what's called heterogeneous integration and advanced packaging to figure out how do you get into, integration of non-CMOS devices onto, single substrates and so forth for heterogeneous integration, and how do you package different types of chiplets together to gain capability. So that's the difference now. Thinking forward, bottom of the compute stack is going to be important, but it has to be integrated. You can't just have materials innovation without thinking what are the applications they're going to be used for. So, yeah.
Right. So for a start, you've already exceeded my vocabulary and knowledge of what we're talking about here. But let me ask you, Paul, with that sort of introductory answer, can you explain why these technologies matter? Right. So we understand that these are the types of technologies that will become increasingly important because of physics, because we're running out of space to build transistors. But why does the ability to either do R&D on this or to actually produce it matter to a country?
Right. I think Edlyn did a great job of defining the stack. I take a slightly different view of the same stack. So at the very bottom of the stack is what I call core ICT. That's semiconductors, fabs and fabless companies, industry, and then systems companies build boxes, 5G infrastructure or data centers. So that's a core layer. Above that are what I call the services layer, where companies like Verizon or AT&T buys these boxes and then deploys services that we all subscribe to. And then on top of these services are what I call the application layer, where it could be Facebook or it could be Google, who run on the services provided by the underlying layer to offer all the services that we are familiar with, Amazon and online shopping and all that. So in this three-tier stack, the fundamental is the core layer, the core ICT, the bottom layer, and of course, every layer is important. India does pretty well in the services layer. We have very good companies. In fact, the wireless Jio and Airtel, their cost of delivery of services is the lowest in the world, so it's really remarkable. And India has also begun to do well in the applications layer. We have a bunch of fintech companies and things like that. But India doesn't participate in the core layer, the core technology layer. That is, typically US and China at the mass level, and of course Taiwan and South Korea are the major participants. Now, as Edlyn pointed out, the core layers where a lot of battleground lies, and it's running into today the top technology node is 5 nanometers, and that's actually the only one company which can do regular chips with it, that is TSMC in Taiwan, and memory chips at 5 nanometers is done by Samsung. But while the United States and China are at least 2 nodes behind them, so in the US probably has got 12 nanometers, and maybe 12 and 20 it's stable, and China probably is in a similar level. But clearly, getting down to 5 for US and China, and for everybody to go beyond 5 to 3 and even lower, is getting more and more difficult. Just for example, at 5 nanometers, already the lithographic machines that are required to do that, it uses extreme ultraviolet. Each litho box costs $150 million, made only by one company in the world, ASML in Holland. So it's getting more, the peak is getting extremely narrow. And actually, in some sense, TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea have done a better job than most countries. And China is also now behind. I mean, they're never number 1, but they've been trying to catch up. Just in terms of investments and fabrication, I think the usual numbers I see from the Semiconductor Industry Association, which I participate in, the world will spend $3 trillion in R&D in fabs in the next 10 years. And China itself, I think, has put more than $1 trillion on the table to get this done, to move forward. US has less tradition of funding industries directly, but we do have a CHIPS Act, I think, in various levels in Congress and the Senate. And I think at least $100 billion will probably come down the pipe for that. So essentially, the world's getting digitalized or digitized, and Core ICT, I think, is the fundamental technology for the future economy of the world, and getting to becoming a leader there is getting more and more difficult. It's getting extremely narrow, extremely expensive. So it's really the real battleground, in my opinion, of leadership within China and US really is predicated around this technology now.
Great. So that's a really good way to sort of conceptualize the competition, right? That it's becoming more expensive. There are fewer and fewer players, be they companies or countries, that can compete at this leading edge. I want to ask Edlyn, and then I want to bring in Trisha on this issue, just teasing out and perhaps zooming out a little bit on this competition, right? Let's take as the premise that the competition is hotting up, it's becoming more expensive, it's becoming more exclusive. What does that actually mean in terms of competition? Like what are the implications of this if only a smaller number of actors can actually compete and quote unquote win this competition, or be the leaders in the field in this competition? If I could ask that of Edlyn, and then Trisha, the perspective from Delhi, if I can bring this in. You know, we've so far been talking a lot about the US and China, which reasonably is probably because they, as well as Taiwan, are leading in these fields. But from the perspective of India, how much of a cause for concern is this? Edlyn?
Yeah, fantastic. So, you know, I think there are several things to understand when it comes to what does leadership mean in the technology landscape. And that comes into understanding it's not so much the country, and as much as it's the companies and the industry working in the country that actually is defining what leadership means. And most of the semiconductor companies in the world are global. It is a highly interactive and global industry. And, you know, there's a lot of discussion, and Paul had mentioned some of the policy actions here in the United States. You know, certainly there's a vision about how do you strengthen, essentially the idea of leadership is how do you strengthen yourself as a hub within a global network such that you are essential in that global network, not how do I essentially onshore and create an entire domestic supply chain. If you do that, you lose out on the massive economies of scale that this industry benefits from. And so the perspective for leadership for a lot of countries, and certainly is the way a lot of leaders in the United States are thinking about this, is how do we become how do we remain and still lead, being a hub of global innovation? Looking at the overall semiconductor value chain then, right, the semiconductor supply chain, realizing that a single, large integrated device manufacturer, for example, can have upwards of 6,000 global suppliers. You realize this global interdependency, which is why some of the supply shocks we're really realizing now are only revealed when there is actually something unhealthy going on in the global ecosystem.
Wait,
please.
Sorry to interrupt, but can you just clarify, when you were talking about this scale, right? 6,000 suppliers. Are those 6,000 suppliers concentrated in a couple of countries, or are they really spread out around the world?
They're spread. There are a couple of countries, of course, who has leadership in semiconductors. And let me break it down by value chain, and I can actually share, some numbers with all of you here. So when it comes to what's called electronic design automation, this is the software that actually enables designing semiconductor components that have, however many billions, tens of billions of transistor elements on them. 74% of that market is in the United States. When it comes to the R&D intensive manufacture of logic chips, that's, from an R&D perspective, that's 67% in the United States. The manufacture, though, of logic chips, that's what Paul was talking about, is dominated by Taiwan. When it comes to also the manufacture, what are other types of chips that are needed, right? And I think Paul had done a good job to mention like service companies, like, who are actually building boxes and devices. If you look at like a base station, when it comes to 5G networks or 4G networks, you have components that require radio front ends, right? So these are the analog and discrete components that get put into these types of devices. There's actually a lot of strength in the United States. Memory, because of Samsung and SK Hynix, there's a big dominance from South Korea. So the countries around the world that are most dominant are the United States. China increasingly is gaining a foothold in the global market. Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Europe, and then smaller footprints. Singapore, Israel, Ireland do have some presence of semiconductors. And that's then the point to think about, when you actually define a strategy for the type of technology development here, you need to tap into this global network and build out market share that's relevant in these different areas, right? So there's, again, across the value chain, there's electronic design automation, there's the manufacturing, there's material suppliers, there's the components integration, assembly, and testing, and then there's overall original equipment manufacturers that embed those components into a system that's actually functional. That's a very coarse-grained view of what the semiconductor value chain actually looks like. So a lot goes into that. And actually, one more thing to add to that, which Paul had mentioned, are the capital equipment suppliers, right? So he mentioned ASML for the extreme ultraviolet lithography capabilities, but there are other companies, and here again, Japan has an incredible strength in capital equipment suppliers. The United States does as well, as does Europe. So a lot going on there.
It's a significantly more fine-grained view than I've ever been exposed to. So thanks for that. So one country that we haven't really, in this huge network of value chain for semiconductors, one country that was conspicuous in its absence was India. Trisha, can I bring you in now? Sitting in Delhi, right, hearing about this intensifying competition abroad, which is not just a US-China thing, but which is really a global phenomenon. What's the perspective in India? How concerned would a country like India that sees increasingly intensifying strategic competition with China, how concerned would it be about its current position?
Sure. So I'll start by saying that there's already been quite a bit of movement in Indian policy making around emerging technologies. We have a national strategy on AI. There is a fairly clear roadmap now on 5G, and like biotechnologies have been an ongoing area of cooperation for years now. And a lot of this policy action and cooperation has taken the form of, say, a network of centers of excellence around the countries based in universities and other private institutions. There's also partnerships, a growing web of partnerships with partners like the US, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Germany, and so on. And then one area that is now an increasing focus, which I agree with Edlyn on, is quantum technologies, essentially. Just a couple of years ago, a viable quantum computer was, by most estimates, at least a decade away, but that calculus seems to be changing pretty rapidly. And to capitalize on this coming revolution, the 2020-2021 budget, union budget, already proposed to spend a whopping 8,000 crore rupees on a new quantum mission in the country. So there's already some movement there. There is already clearly a sense of urgency given the pretty sizable chunk of funding that has been allotted. And with this, India joins a small but growing group of countries like Canada, France, South Korea that have now a dedicated quantum strategy. The second aspect I want to address as I answer your questions is on the effect of the US-China strategic competition on India's own thinking. At a global level, of course, emerging technologies, the processes around them are increasingly embroiled in geopolitics, in this strategic competition. And even now, if you just do a Google search for quantum tech, the words US, China, and race are kind of pegged onto it. So consequently, a concern that may arise, especially within India, is that international norms around quantum technologies might follow a trajectory similar to that of AI or space, where the processes are either in limbo or they're scattered across disparate sets of principles that sound similar, but you don't have like a clear agreement of what these would mean in practice. Then a second issue that would loom large is that the geopoliticization of emerging technologies is there's often an Americentric lens to it. And by that, I mean, there's an assumption that other countries view emerging technologies through the same zero-sum game, strategic competition security lens as DC does. That is not really the case in India. Of course, geopolitics is not a factor, but India's own strategy documents on emerging technologies are more focused on socio-economic impacts of these technologies. Say, for example, the AI for All strategy, which is the national AI strategy, they're all focused on inclusive and sustainable growth. And while strategic competition is not unlikely to be on the minds of policymakers, it's still very much focused on domestic capabilities and strengths rather than, okay, we have to compete with China.
That's actually a really good segue to the next set of issues that I wanted to discuss, because it sort of relates to this dilemma that Indian governments have faced on so many issues, which is the dilemma of guns versus butter, right? Because as a still developing country with scarce resources, it has to make tough decisions on what matters the most. So I want to now talk about government policy, right? What is actually the government's role, optimal role, in fostering a productive high-tech ecosystem in a country, right? We've already established that, okay, companies are the real agents of this ecosystem, this competition, if to the extent that it is a competition. So Paul, can I come back to you and ask, if we look sort of generally at China, the US, what is what are the lessons learned in looking across these countries about what types of government intervention or government policy most effectively foster a high-tech ecosystem in these countries?
Thank you, Azan. So, that's a great question. So I think certainly the real conceptual and the leader here is the United States. So we sort of invented this concept of a triple helix, where government, industry, and research universities form a close partnership. And that was kind of launched in the late 40s by Professor Vannevar Bush from MIT, I think with support of Roosevelt and later President Truman. And that is, then later on we added NSF and DARPA. It's become a huge R&D engine, which Edlyn talked about. So been an enormous success story, but this partnership largely has remained, at least where I come from, like Stanford, has been relevant. At Stanford, for example, all the money we get is in basic research, a little bit in applied research. But the government really did not get into funding industry directly. And I think we didn't want to pick losers, winners or losers. So much of it is really in the lower layers of basic and applied research. And that's done very well for the country. Once you take things to some level of maturity, then venture capital comes in, and then fundamentally the companies grow organically, and then they sort of started funding themselves. For example, if you take core ICT, that we just defined as semiconductors, fabulous boxes, systems and boxes, the world global market value is about $500 billion. Of that, about 30%, that's something like 150 billion. I'm sorry, the world market of that is 1.5 trillion, 1.45 trillion. Of that 30%, that's something like 450 billion is R&D plowed back into the system. So there's a huge R&D engine driving this forward. I mean, this is the Intels and Broadcoms and Qualcomms of the world. And so the government participation in this kind of funding is very small. It's much smaller because it only funds universities and basic research. But this holistic chain is well in place in the United States. China didn't have these universities that we had in the United States. So they actually was more manufacturing-led kind of a growth. They started off with getting technology transfer mainly from Europe and the United States, then began to build their universities. So now they have Tsinghua, which is now probably within the top 25 in the world, and they have another 7 top 100. And I sometimes I teach at these universities in China. So they're coming up very rapidly. But in China, the government played a much larger role, even at the industry level. So they've been funding, very indirectly or indirectly. There's also WTO rules involved. They've built entire city, for example, around 5G in order to test 5G technologies. And when they brought in fab technology from Samsung or from Taiwan, TSMC, they built an entire city around those fabs so that the Koreans coming from Samsung could have their own churches and their own bazaars or daily flights back to Seoul. And government spent a lot of money trying to bring in technology and make it happen. So it's a different model, but they've been growing very rapidly too. India is, of course, not really, India has huge potential, but has not paid attention so far to these areas. And as well, for example, in core ICT, we actually had a fab going back to the 1980s, way ahead of China. But today, for a variety of reasons, we shut the fab down some years ago. And China now has about 25 fabs. And they're not yet at the top level, but they're trying to come up the ladder. So India's potential remains. It's just that I think government policy mechanisms have been missing in India, largely because the key departments are overseen by bureaucrats who spend their lifetime doing running in state government, running the economic systems or road building. And then they walk into these departments in Delhi, and they're very, very bright, but they don't have the background. So India has not put a cohesive policy together. I think I've been trying to do some of that in Delhi, but India is clearly, once it starts moving, will move very fast.
So that is actually, I mean, that's an issue that we see in the defense world as well, right? Of bright and dedicated but non-expert civil servants running policy. And we'll come back to the sort of specifics of policy as well. But before I do, just one last question on this sort of issue of government policy broadly. And I want to turn now to the issue of sort of government, if we can call it this, foreign technology policy, right? Edlyn, I want to ask you, you brought up this issue of the importance, the vitality of global supply chains, and put it really well that the objective of many countries is to become an indispensable node in these international networks. So I want to ask you this question about decoupling, right? Especially in the context of US-China and India-China, we hear about this notion of technology decoupling, or in India's case, for example, in response to a military crisis, there was an effort to ban some Chinese apps, for example. But my question for you is, to what extent is decoupling really even a viable option? How much can any country decouple from another country, a specific country like China? And to what extent is that self-injurious, self-defeating if it wants to cultivate for its firms a competitive tech ecosystem?
It's a great question. And there's a lot of complexity behind it. The first, I guess, aspect of decoupling is whether or not it's possible. There might simply be, aspects of the supply chain that you can only find in one place. So I'll go back to the example that Paul had given before. 92% of global manufacturing at technology nodes for logic chips below 10 nanometers is Taiwan. So if you want to decouple from Taiwan, as an example, you will probably have to give up access to leading edge nodes in logic chips, period. When it comes to China, China doesn't have that type of dominance in that area specifically, but it plays an enormous role in, for example, assembly and testing of integrated circuits, the packaging of integrated circuits. Very few chips do not pass through China on their way into your end product devices because of that. So currently, decoupling is, from a practical point of view, not possible. There's also the economics behind decoupling. Which is, if a country actually wants to, have an element of onshoring, the United States, for example, is looking at onshoring manufacturing. It's moving against the global policy landscape that has set also, the economics behind this. Adam Smith's invisible hand. Why did manufacturing leave the United States? If you look at the early days of the semiconductor industry, this was a largely US or solely US affair. It was developed here. The technology was developed here. It was manufactured here. And over time, starting with, Fairchild in the 1960s, the types of economic considerations, such as labor costs, started moving manufacturing abroad. If you want to onshore that manufacturing, you're going to have to pay a higher price. So the question then also becomes, is the US government willing to pay a higher price for microelectronics? Are US consumers willing to pay a higher price for microelectronics, assuming that they're manufactured in the United States or manufactured in a global supply chain that does not include China? The last portion about the economics, which is just a very real reality, is that China constitutes, I believe it's somewhere upwards of 54% of the global semiconductor market. And so if you want to decouple your economic activity from China, you are asking your companies to essentially compete, again, in a high-tech industry where economies of scale make a huge difference. You're telling them cut off half of the world market and then remain competitive. That is a huge proposition, which frankly, a lot of companies will tell you is not possible. So there are many aspects to it. Yeah.
So, you started by talking about Taiwan's centrality to the fabrication of these chips. and this is something that's been in the press a lot, right? As the issue of Taiwan's security and the possibility of Chinese aggression against Taiwan rises, people have been worried about this semiconductor industry and Taiwan's place in it. Not necessarily specific to that, but using that as a case, for example, how feasible is it to replicate that kind of fabrication capacity in another country? Is that even a possibility, or is it the sort of thing that would take decades and is therefore, for all intents and purposes, impossible?
It is not easily possible. It is not easily possible. The easiest possible way, Arzan, to do that, frankly, is to partner with the Taiwanese companies that are in the lead, like TSMC. You know, a lot of people will talk about the, you know, leading edge logic as, you know, there are three companies, right? There's Samsung and TSMC and leading edge nodes, and then Intel's you know, slightly behind at this point, but, you know, still maintains, you know, very, very high end nodes. They don't manufacture each other's chips. You know, you cannot take a, you know, design that was designed for TSMC process and move it into an Intel fab facility. It does not work. And so if you think about all of the companies, all of the fabless companies that depend on the foundry capability that exists in Taiwan, that's not reproducible very quickly. And, you know, to your point also, by the way, when it comes to the prospect of, you know, China taking over, you know, Taiwan, the manufacture of chips, right? You cannot simply, you know, march in and take over operations of a fab if you don't have a knowledgeable workforce and workplace. And so it is not simply, you know, a prospect of, okay, you know, now China's in charge and suddenly, you know, the aspect of you know, dependence is changed, right? It is still TSMC who will have to be operating the fabs because they have that knowledge for how it is to manufacture the integrated circuits. It's a very, very complicated process. It cannot be simply copy and paste somewhere. So, you know, if you do end up losing it, then, you know, that is loss of access, and it's impossible to replicate in the near term. 100%.
I would, you know, completely agree with what Edlyn said. I add one more important question is United States actually led this technology. We invented the transistors and integrated circuits. A lot of it happened right here in Silicon Valley. But how come Taiwan actually became the dominant leader? I think it's one aspect of Indian US industry is that it's very Wall Street focused, and therefore investments in long-term R&D is challenged by Wall Street dimensions, factors. And I think while in TSMC in Taiwan, it was always a long-term view of things. And of course, they had a very visionary leader, Morris Chang, again, a Stanford alum. And so I think the leadership, patience, investments, and time, it takes time. We cannot build the fab that Taiwan builds in 10 years, in 2 or 3 years. It's a history of growing understanding over many, in fact, decades. So I think the US again has to take a long-term view to recapture leadership, and certainly we need to do that. But Taiwan, I think it's really is really a long-term thinking that has brought it to the fore.
Yeah, great. That's a very useful angle. Trisha, I want to just one quick last question again before I turn to the next section. We've actually had a question come through on the Q&A that I wonder if you could address, which is when you brought up the investments that the Indian government is making, for example, in quantum computing, either that specifically or in sort of India's the government's policy generally. Do you have a sense of how that compares with other countries? I mean, it's, you know, 8,000 crores sounds like a lot, right? But is it actually a lot when you compare it to the investments made in other countries?
Well, I mean, if we were to compare numbers, India's quantum budget is pretty sizable. We can take, for example, Canada's, which is around 280 million US dollars, which is like a quarter of the Indian budget. But I would say that budget metrics are not the only metric we should be looking at. The Indian bureaucracy is known to be slow. So the metrics we should be measuring is if the centers, the quantum centers of excellence have been set up, what kind of skill sets they've managed to hire, what the performance of these centers are. That is something that we would really need to measure over time. I would say that just numbers are not the best metric. I mean, they look great on paper, but we should be measuring performance in these sectors.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, any sort of...
Arjan, could I make a comment? Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, I think, Trisha made a very good comment about quantum computing, but we have to realize that quantum computing is still a pie in the sky, and even if it becomes real, and there are people who question that too, it still only addresses a very narrow piece of computing. So semiconductors or something that replaces semiconductors, it could be a carbon nanotube, but digital type computing is absolutely the foundation of the country's technology. And so India really should put 99.9% of focus on what we need today, and that is semiconductor technology. Because for decades to come, that will remain the bedrock for the country.
That's really interesting, actually, because it's a very neat segue into the next section that I want to talk about, which is sort of the building blocks of a country's competitiveness in these fields. And clearly, it is a decades-long project, right? Because it requires everything from basic education to pure research as well as applied research. It is something that takes years or decades to come to fruition. And so I wonder, let's start with Edlyn. If we're talking about trying to cultivate this sort of, again, I keep using the term ecosystem, if we're trying to cultivate this sort of environment for firms to thrive, right? Setting aside policy settings about competition policy, et cetera. But if you're talking about just the building blocks of what is required, right? The people that is required to be competitive, obviously many things matter, right? Like I said, education, R&D, industry R&D. How is there a winning formula for what is the balance here? Is when we're talking about, for example, semiconductors and quantum computing, is there a prospect of leapfrogging these technologies by investing in very long-term building blocks that will come to fruition in a couple of decades, but not now? Or is it really a matter of putting in the investments in R&D that will result in applications more quickly? That's a very fuzzy question, Edlyn, but I wonder if you can sort of tease out the building blocks of this.
Yeah, there's a good question. And, one thing perhaps to understand first and foremost is there is no single one winning formula. Different countries have different capabilities, have different, approaches to crafting policy and developing their high-tech sectors. And so each country needs to look at where its strengths are, potentially build on those strengths, and then also where its weaknesses are and where there are strategic weaknesses to fill in the blanks. However, there are some common features to a high-tech R&D ecosystem that are important to understand around which good policy can be crafted. And a little bit of this was discussed in some of Paul's comments with regard to the growth of the semiconductor industry in this country, and how it has subsequently evolved in industrial policy. We in the United States don't have heavy-handed industrial policy for the very point that Paul was mentioning, not picking winners and losers. And in fact, governments, at least in our point of view of government and US government is not good at picking winners and losers. Rather, what governments are really good at doing is creating an ecosystem of innovation whereby winners and losers can emerge and compete and drive innovation forward. That being said, and I'm speaking specifically about the United States here, the US has, either consciously or I would actually think more subconsciously made a bet on the ability to continue to remain a leader in science and technology while trending toward being a design and consumer economy, right? So we've offshored a lot of that manufacturing muscle that we used to have. And that is actually not recognizing this other aspect of innovation. In an innovation cycle, there are two large stages, right? That from a coarse-grained point of view, you can say. There's the initial discovery that something is possible, right? That's sort of the inception point. That's what a lot of the R&D strength in the United States does, from universities, from national laboratories, from all of the basic and applied science that we do here so well, which is showing and proving from a physics and engineering point of view that one can do something that no one else has done before. But there's a very different problem taking that initial demonstration and moving it from doing it once to doing it a billion times, a million billion times that would need to be done on a high volume manufacturing scale. The technical problems to make that second step are now currently what is undervalued and underinvested in the United States' science policy aspect to investment in these types of high-tech sectors. And actually that's where you run into, where are the problems currently, at least in the US innovation ecosystem. There's a lot of good work that happens in the university and basic research setting that never sees the light of day from a commercial point of view because there is no funding, there is no support network, there is no infrastructure and manufacturing facilities in the US that can support and sustain that. And, to point, a lot of innovation, at least in the high end of that compute stack we had talked about at the beginning, is currently funded to the commercial, right, from its inception to commercialization from the venture capital world. But venture capital is not going to invest in your hardware startup if it takes you $20 million to get to first silicon. It's not going to happen. The risk-adjusted return on investment simply does not make sense for the venture community. And that's where the investment aspect, and in the investment community doesn't actually step in. And that's where, again, from a strategic point of view, a government might need to think very strongly, how do I create an innovation ecosystem that not only addresses that, proof of principle, first concept, but actually it's transition all the way through to commercialization.
That's
say that Edlyn was spot on. Yeah.
Sorry, Paul. Let me just set it up, and I'm coming to you next, and then Trisha. That's an excellent sort of excellent framework. And I ask you, Paul and Trisha, both, how do you see India in that framing? India's strengths and weaknesses, and referring, we had another question referring to, is India doing the triple helix well? And I would add one more thing, the idea of gaining technology from abroad. To what extent is India adept at doing that, and need it do more on that? So Paul and then Trisha, could you answer how India is doing?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just go back to Edlyn's comments. I think she picked up all very important points. And one area that I'm actually focused on in the US area is that, moving good ideas from universities all the way till they actually get funded by a VC itself is a difficult chain of events. And I think we need more mechanisms in the United States to make that better. I always look at Israel, who seem to do a better job there. So with that comment, to go back to India, India, at least my narrow viewpoint of India is that just take core ICT. I mean, there are other high technology industries, commercial jets or advanced instrumentation, branded pharma. All these are very R&D intensive, very, very high technology industries. India has not yet stepped into this. I mean, they have the potential, but not stepped into this area. But into core ICT, I think, at least this is my 2 cents, is India needs to build a group of people who understand this industry. I mean, it's investments needed, There's a lot of IP. I mean, it's full of litigation. There's standards involved. So it's a very, very large system to get into. And because India doesn't have a presence here today, it doesn't have an internal knowledge base to really craft policies which will propel the country forward. So I feel that I think is the number one priority of India, is to tap into external knowledge. I'm sure it is available to try and craft the right policies. China did a good job. They would send out tens of thousands of scholars abroad, and many of them I hosted at Stanford. We used to host many of them. Not sure how many now, and many prominent professors from the United States, taught in Chinese universities. So there was a lot of exchange of knowledge, and of course they learned a lot through contract manufacturing and building up supply chains. So China reached out and integrated as much as they could and learned a lot. India has not done that. So I think, at least my view is that in order for India to craft successful policies, it really has to understand this industry, what drives it, all the mechanisms. Only then I think it can be successful in moving forward.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Trisha?
Thanks, Handson. I agree with Edlyn that there is really no one size fits all approach when it comes to how hands-on a government should be in emerging tech sectors. And India is neither on the US model nor the China model. It's a bit of a hybrid case. I mean, it's not got its hands in most emerging tech sector pies per se, but there are public sector undertakings that have near monopolies in certain sectors. For example, rare earths is one, where one public sector undertaking, IREL, controls sole mining rights for rare earths, which I believe there are some talks of changing, because rare earths is now becoming one of those strategic areas that is also of interest to India's international partners. But India in that sense is a hybrid case. And again, I agree that the role of the government should be as a facilitator in setting up a conducive environment for investment, making sure that regulations don't place onerous requirements on market entrants and so on. But also, in India's case, investment in basic infrastructure, and this includes electricity and other like connectivity infrastructure, water, and so on. All of these are core elements to these industries as well. And also, of course, research and development and skills. The other thing I do want to say is you mentioned international partnerships. And yes, so the government has been doing quite a bit of outreach. I know in semiconductors, there's been quite a bit of movement. India, like the government has been approaching a wish list of semiconductor manufacturers around the world, and there has been like mutual interest. And so there is movement there. And there especially has been a lot of outreach to Taiwan. I was at a webinar recently, and again, the interest is mutual, but a lot of concerns remain in terms of precisely these facilitating factors in terms of the regulatory environment and basic infrastructure.
Yeah, great. Thank you. We have time, I think, for just one last question, and I want to ask it with a slightly different emphasis to all of you. And I'll ask in turn Edlyn and Paul and Trisha. We've been talking a lot about other countries like the US, which have for decades set what we might call best practice in how to cultivate at least a world-leading tech ecosystem, because the US has been the world leader, right? But I want to ask you now, let's set that aside for a minute. And I'll ask you, Edlyn, in a more general way, and Paul and Trisha in a way specific to India. Edlyn, if you were, there's a lot of path dependence, right, in how the US's policy as well as industry and academic worlds have grown up. There's a lot of path dependence, which has led the US to the current position it is in. But if you were to take a step back, if you were to design a tech ecosystem from a blank page, right, not path dependent, for the types of technologies and the types of competition, the strategic context that we find ourselves in, how would you design it? Or what changes would you make to the current environment that you see in the US, for example? And Paul and Trisha, if I can ask to apply this specifically to India, if you were in PMO right now, right, taking into account India's particular strengths and weaknesses, as we've discussed, right? No, there is no one size fits all. There's no right model. There's no right way to do this. But taking India's specific strengths and weaknesses, given that India can't do everything, where should Indian policy be focused to make the most productive gains? Edlyn?
So it's a fantastic question. I think the most important principle to consider here is that no single country has a monopoly on good ideas. And if you are starting with a blank slate, your best ticket to success is partnership. If you look at the history of semiconductor industry, ITRI's initial core of engineers who started the ITRI ecosystem in Taiwan that then led to UMC and TSMC spinouts were trained in New Jersey. They came over to the United States. Similar with early, Japanese technology giants, they went over to Bell Laboratories to learn about early semiconductor technologies. Where did the United States learn about semiconductor technologies? I mean, initially, it was riding on the emergence of a new science called quantum mechanics and learning about those aspects of quantum mechanics with many body systems, right? That means many, many atoms in a crystal with many electrons, and how do those systems behave? So a lot of the US scientists were trained by European pioneers in quantum theory, and came over with the practical application of how do I build useful things out of this. And a lot of, the US science and technology ecosystem benefited, frankly, from a transition of technology that came through immigration from Europe and then also from around the world. So, I look at policies that are deleterious to the United States' standing in advanced technologies, and our immigration policy is disastrous. We have world-leading universities that attract global talent, the world's best talent from around the world. And the US immigration policy should do everything possible to retain that talent after degree granting. It's absolutely essential. Instead, we actually have policies that do the exact opposite. So that's first and foremost a key thing that needs to change. Other aspects are, again, going back to ecosystem drivers. In environments that allow for non-competitiveness because of high tax, export control that disincentivize inventing in the United States. Types of, frankly, environmental regulations that, although might prevent the US emissions, right, mean that US companies or other companies who don't want to abide by those regulations go and build and fabricate in non-healthy manufacturing paradigms elsewhere in the world. So instead of a temporal externality, you actually have a geographic externality. You're still polluting the same amount to get to the same product. So why not create, green manufacturing as a program in the United States? So, there's a lot that the US needs to do, right? So, think about technology competitiveness, think about the cost and economics, but most importantly, think about the fact that this is a global industry, there's global talent, and, there needs to be a marketplace of ideas that draws from that global world. So immigration, I would say, is a key aspect. So.
Yeah, well, speaking as an immigrant, I couldn't agree more. I think it was a former energy secretary who made a comment that along similar lines, that every foreign student in the US, when they walk across the stage to receive their diploma, should have a green card stapled to the back of it.
Yes. Yes.
Paul?
Right. I would again believe it, Edlyn, and I'll just add one more comment is that the race for technology, global race, which certainly is heating up, is really the race for talent. Countries which can accumulate the talent, and the talent is all over the world, are most likely to succeed. So I think US has done well so far, but I think it can do more. coming back to India, India has enormous potential, enormous potential. I myself spent half my life there, and I know the potential that lies in the country. And India, even in core ICT, has a lot of knowledge because a lot of these American companies or European companies or Chinese companies have R&D centers in India. The Intel, in fact, I done 3 semiconductor companies, and 2 of them, most of it was based in India, a little bit in China. So enormous talent, but they're not Indian headquartered companies. And I think India needs Indian headquartered companies for a variety of reasons. So the question, therefore, is how does India move forward in this larger picture? Certainly, as everyone has pointed out, this is too complex technology, too much investment needed for a country to stand on its own. It's totally impossible. So India really has to open out and engage with the world in different ways. And one of the ways I've been emphasizing is to understand this industry from people who run it, but perhaps also attract people. If India can attract back a few people who have lived and in this industry and understand it, that will bring in a lot of new knowledge. So I think take a global view and attracting back knowledge, talent into the country, I think is critical to moving forward.
Excellent, thank you. And Trisha?
So Edlyn and Paul have covered quite a bit of ground. So I'll just focus on maybe a couple of areas. The first is, we haven't really spoken about it in the course of this discussion, but data governance, which is kind of a building block for a lot of like smart applications, AI and so on. And India's data governance is like data protection legislation is very much in flux right now. And there is a certain degree of certainty needed with something as fundamental as the PDP bill for there to be more clarity on the sectors that depend on it. And then data in another sense, I want to address data in another sense, and that is that there needs to be an exercise within the Indian government to really map the country's technological and economic dependencies. The data is very patchy on where India is placed on various value chains, and then where it can best leverage its own strengths then to patch any issues there. So yes, data in these 2 senses, I think, should be the priority.
That's excellent. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, absolutely. Things that we failed to discuss, but I'm grateful that you brought them up. We are out of time, but I want to thank you all. That was sensational. I learned a lot. I learned really, truly a lot. Certainly compared to my research world, the world of defense, it's very clear that the high-tech world is much more interdependent, much more global and interdependent. A country's strengths and position depends a lot more on what happens in other countries. And so the idea of decoupling or disaggregating that is a very, very fraught issue. And it also, you guys really drove home the point that this is a type of policy that requires not just long-term thinking, which it obviously does, but also, like the technology itself, it requires an integration of different systems and different policies, right? So it's not just technology policy, it is also everything up to and including immigration policy that will determine a country's success in this. So thank you very much. And thank you out there in Zoom land, and we will see you again in 2022.